I still remember the smell of that evening, wood smoke and cold. The kind of cold that doesn't knock, the kind that gets up under your coat and sits down against your ribs and makes itself at home like it owns you. I was 17 years old, and I want to tell you, I thought I already knew what cold was. I grew up in Montana. I'd scrape the inside of windows in February, but I didn't know. Not really. Not the way you know a thing when it's trying to take somebody from you. My Uncle Vernon didn't shout. I need you to understand that before I tell you the rest, because I think people expect shouting. They expect a slammed door, a fist on a table, ugly words you can hold against a man forever. It would almost have been easier if it had gone that way. You can hate a man who shouts. What I got was worse, because there was nothing in it to hate. Vernon just stood in the doorway with the porch light behind him, so his face was all shadow, and his shoulders were down, and he looked older than I had ever seen a person look. "I can't even keep myself going, Wren," he said. "God help me. I cannot carry three." That was the whole of it. My brother Silas was 10 years old, and our mother had been in the ground for 41 days. I counted them. I don't know why I counted them. I think it was because I needed something to be sure of, and the days were the only thing nobody could take back or argue with. 41. The way you count stairs in the dark with your hand on the rail, just to have something steady underneath you while the rest of the world tips. Let me tell you how we came to be standing on Vernon's porch so you'll understand. My father died when I was 9. He was a logger, like a lot of men were in that part of the country before the mills started closing, and a load shifted on the Ridge Road one wet morning, and that was the end of him. I remember the truck coming up our street. I remember my mother's hands. After that, it was just the three of us, Mama and me and Silas, in a little rented house down by the highway that always smelled faintly of the laundromat 2 doors down. We were poor, but we were warm, and we were together, and I did not understand back then that those are the only 3 things that matter, and that a person can lose all 3. Then Mama got tired. That's how it started, just tired. Then there was a word the doctors used that I won't repeat because I still can't say it without my throat closing. Then there was a long bad winter, and then a spring she didn't see the end of. And then it was just Silas and me, and a stack of bills with my dead mother's name on them, and a landlord who was sorry, but who had his own family to feed. So Vernon took us in. He was my father's older brother, a mechanic, 50 years old, and he lived alone in a little house on the edge of Cedar Hollow because his own wife had left him years before and there'd been no children. He took us in because blood is supposed to mean something, and for 6 weeks it did. He wasn't warm with us. He didn't know how to be, but he made sure there was food, and he gave Silas his own room and slept on the couch himself. And once I caught him standing in the door watching Silas sleep with a look on his face I didn't have a name for then. Then the shop cut his hours, then they cut them again. Then the letters started coming with the red printing on the envelopes, the kind that mean the bank is done being patient. And on a Tuesday at the end of October, with the light going gold and then gray over the Montana pines, Vernon stood in his own doorway and told me to take my little brother and go. He gave us what he could. I have made my peace with that part. He gave us an old canvas backpack with a broken zipper. He gave us 2 wool army blankets, gray and scratchy, half a loaf of bread in a grocery sack. And he pressed money into my hand, folded so many times it had gone soft as cloth, and when I got far enough down the road to count it under a streetlight, it was $40. I think it was every dollar he had. "I'm sorry," he said. He couldn't look at me. "I'm so sorry, Wren." And the truth is, I believe he was. That's the part I've never been able to put down. He wasn't cruel. He was just drowning, and a drowning man can't hold anybody up. He let go of us, the way you let go when your own arms have given out. I forgave him a long time ago. It took me years, but I did. Silas held the cuff of my sleeve. He'd taken hold of it the second we came down off the porch, and he did not let go. He's a quiet boy, my brother. Always was. The kind of quiet that makes grown people think he isn't paying attention when the truth is he's the one in the room paying the most. He notices everything. He just doesn't always tell you what he's noticed. Where are we going? He asked me. I looked down the road. Behind us were the lights of town, the warm windows, the church steeple, the one traffic light blinking yellow over Main Street. Ahead of us was the county road, and past that, climbing up into the dark hills, the old logging track that nobody used anymore since they'd shut the mill on the far side of the valley. I did not have an answer for him. But I had already learned the first law of being the older one, the one nobody teaches you, the one you learn the hour your mother dies. You never, ever let them hear that you don't know. Somewhere better, I said. Come on now, before the dark catches us. And we walked. Let me stop here just for a breath, because I want to ask you something before I tell you what we walked into. If you'd been me that night, 17 years old, your mother just buried, your little brother's hand in yours, the only door left to you just shut at your back, where would you have gone? I truly want to know. There's no wrong answer. Tell me down in the comments below. I read every single one of them every night, and I think about the women on the other side of them. Now, let me tell you about the walk. Cedar Hollow has maybe 3,000 people in it, and that night every last one of them was home behind their windows with the lamps lit and the stoves going. And I remember the strangest thought came to me as we walked out past the edge of town. I thought about how warmth could be so close right there on the other side of the glass and still not be yours. How a person could freeze to death 20 feet from a fireplace just because it belonged to somebody else. That seemed to me the cruelest arithmetic in the world. We passed the feed store with its windows dark. We passed Mercer's Hardware. We passed the diner, and through the steamed-up glass I could see two men in a booth, and there was coffee in front of them, white cups with steam coming up off them, and a woman in an apron leaning on the counter laughing at something one of them had said. I made myself look away from it. You learn to do that when you have nothing. You learn not to look at what's behind the glass. The pavement ran out, the road turned to gravel, and the gravel crunched under our boots, loud in the quiet. Then even the gravel gave up, and it was just dirt. And then the dirt narrowed and grass grew up the middle of it, and I knew we'd found the old logging track, two ruts climbing up into the pines with the dark coming down between the trees like water filling a glass. That's when the cold got serious. You don't notice it at first, the cold. When you're moving, when your blood is up, when you're angry, and I was angry. I was so angry I could have set the whole valley on fire with it. The anger keeps you warm a while, but anger is cheap fuel. It burns fast, and it burns out, and when it's gone, there's nothing underneath it but the cold, and the cold is patient, and the cold is old, far older than any anger, and it just waits for you. It waits for you to slow down. It has all the time in the world. Silas slowed down. I heard it before I let myself see it, his footsteps getting shorter, the little dragging scrape of his boots that he made when he was wearing out. I'd been hearing it for 10 minutes and telling myself it wasn't happening the way you do. I turned around, and in the last gray light coming through the trees, my brother's face was the color of skim milk. His lips had gone a shade of blue I had never seen on a living person, and something dropped inside my chest, straight down through the floor of me, a feeling I have never felt before or since, like an elevator with the cable cut. I'm tired, Ren, he said, so quiet, so matter of fact. I'm just real tired. And here is the thing I have never told another living soul, until this very moment, telling you. Standing on that logging track in the dark, I understood that my brother could die, not someday, not in some far-off grown-up way that happens to other people and other families. That night, in those woods, if I did not find us a roof and a fire before the dark finished coming down, the cold would take him, the way it takes the small ones and the slow ones, quietly, almost gently, and I would be left standing over him in the morning with the sun coming up pretty and uncaring through the pines, and nothing in the world to do but scream into the trees where no one would ever hear me. I did not let 1 second of that show on my face. I knelt down in front of him in the cold mud. I took his cold face in my 2 hands. "Hey," I said, "hey, look at me. We're close now, you hear? I can feel it. There's something just up ahead. I know it. You and me. We just have to get there. You and me. It's always been you and me, hasn't it? Hasn't it always?" "Always," he whispered. It was a lie, the part about being close. I had no earthly idea where we were or what was ahead. But I have learned something in my life about lies, and it is this. Sometimes a lie is the kindest true thing you have left to give a person. The truth that night would have killed him faster than the cold. So I gave him the lie, and I gave it to him with my whole heart, and I pulled his thin arm up over my shoulders, and I stood us both up, and we went on. We went on like that, the two of us leaned together into one thing with 3 legs, lurching up that track in the dark. And I'll tell you something I'm not ashamed of. I prayed. I am not a praying woman. I never have been. Not before that night, and not for a long while after. But that night I prayed to anything at all that might be bending an ear toward those mountains. I didn't ask for much. I want you to know I didn't ask for much. Just a roof, I prayed. Just a door that closes. Just one small dry place out of this wind. And I swear to you, I will take it from there. I will do the rest myself. Just give me the one thing. And then I saw the fence. You would have missed it. Anyone would have, who wasn't as desperate as I was, whose eyes weren't peeled raw, looking for exactly that. Old wooden fence posts, gone gray and soft with rot, half swallowed up in the dead weeds and the creeping moss, marching off crooked into the trees. But I knew what a fence meant. A fence meant a person had been here, a person meant a building. A building meant walls, and walls meant out of the wind, and out of the wind meant my brother might see the morning. I followed it. I dragged us both along that broken fence line into the trees, and the pines opened up into a little clearing, and there in the clearing, set back in the dark, was a cabin. I want you to see it the way I saw it. I have replayed that first sight 10,000 times in the years since, and I will go on replaying it until the day they put me in the ground beside the people I loved. It was small, smaller than Vernon's house, smaller than the rented place by the highway. The roof sagged down on one side, like a tired old shoulder that had carried too much for too long. One window was broken clean out, just a black square, and the dark inside it seemed to lean toward us, hungry. Wild grapevines had climbed all up one wall and gone right under the eaves, the way the forest does, when it has decided a thing belongs to it again and means to take it back, leaf by leaf. It looked abandoned. It looked like a place that had simply given up and sat down to die in the woods. And my heart sank, even as I steered us toward it, because some part of me had hoped for warm windows, for smoke, for somebody to open a door and gasp and pull us in by the fire. And there was none of that. There was just this broken, dark, dying thing in the trees. But then Silas, leaning on my shoulder, lifted his head. He went still in the way he does, and he pointed. "Wren," he breathed. "Look." And I followed his thin, pointing finger to the south side of the cabin, where the last of the light still reached. And that is the moment that everything in my life turned. Though I didn't know it yet. You never do. Because there, beneath the dead and frosted weeds, almost hidden, were rows. Straight ones, garden rows, spaced just so that even careful spacing a person only makes when they mean to come back and tend a thing, when they have a plan for the spring. Somebody had grown food there. Somebody had knelt down in that dirt with their bare hands and coaxed the cold ground into giving something up. Tomatoes, maybe. Beans, potatoes. A whole garden gone to weed and frost, but the bones of it still there in the earth, still holding the shape of the hands that made it. And standing in that freezing clearing with my dying brother on my arm, I understood something I have never forgotten. This place had not always been forgotten. It had been left. And there is a world of difference between those two words. A forgotten place was never loved by anyone. It just fell down on its own, out where no eyes were. But a left place was loved and then loved no more because something happened. Somebody died, or somebody had to go, and the loving stopped before the place was ready to stop being loved. A left place still holds the shape of the hands that held it. You can feel it. I could feel it that night, standing in the weeds. And something in me, some animal thing down below where the words live, understood that a place that had been loved once might, just might, be willing to be loved again. So I took my brother to the door. The door did not want to open. I put my shoulder against it and shoved, and it dragged across the floorboards inside with a long, groaning scrape, the sound of something waking up that did not particularly want to wake. A breath of cold air rolled out to meet us. Old air, dead air, air that smelled of cold ash and dust and years of nobody breathing it. I got Silas inside and pushed the door shut against the wind, and for a moment the two of us just stood there in the pitch dark, breathing, listening to each other breathe. Then my eyes started to come around to it, and the moonlight found the broken window and the cracks in the walls, and I began to see it was one room mostly, a narrow little kitchen corner at the back with an empty shelf and a dry stone sink. Everything wore that gray skin of long abandonment, that fur of dust. There was a wooden chair with a faded quilt thrown over the back of it, a rusted oil lantern hanging on a nail by the window, empty shelves where a life used to be kept, and there, in the middle of the room, squat and black and patient, an iron stove. I went to it the way you cross a crowded room toward the one face you know. I put my hands on it. It was cold as the grave. I worked the little door of it open, and it shrieked on its hinge, and inside was old gray ash, dead a long time. But the body of it was sound. I knocked on it, and it rang dull and solid, not cracked, not rusted through, just cold, just waiting. I have owned beautiful things since then, a few. But I have never in my life loved an object the way I loved that ugly iron stove in that first dark minute. It was the first kind thing the world had done for us in a long, long time, and it hadn't even done anything yet. It was just capable of kindness. That was enough to make me want to weep. And then the moonlight, coming silver through the cracks, showed me something against the wall beside the stove that made my breath stop in my throat. Firewood, a small stack of it, split and stacked and dry set well back from the broken window where no rain or snow could reach it. It was not much. Enough for one night maybe, if I was careful. But one night was the only thing I had asked for. One night was the entire size of my prayer. Silas had already crawled up into the chair and pulled that faded quilt down around his thin shoulders, and he was shaking so hard I could hear his teeth knocking together, a small dry rattle in the dark. I had to get the fire going. Everything in the world had narrowed down to that one thing. There was a tin can on the shelf, and when I shook it, it rattled. Matches, the long wooden kind. I worked one out with fingers gone so cold and clumsy, they barely felt like my own. I struck it. It snapped clean in half. I want you to understand what that small dry sound did to me, that little snap, because the whole night was in it. The cold and the dark, and my brother's blue lips, and the 40 empty miles in every direction. The match broke and my heart broke right along with it. I made myself breathe. I took out the second match. I struck it, and it flared up bright and beautiful. And I leaned in to feed it to the kindling, and a draft came sneaking through the broken window and laid its cold hand on that little flame and snuffed it out. Just like that. Gone. A curl of smoke, and the smell of sulfur, and nothing. 2 matches left, I could see them in the tin. Just two. Behind me, very small, my brother said, "Ren?" And I thought, with a kind of terrible calm, there is no version of tonight where I fail at this. That version does not exist. I will not allow it to exist. I turned my back fully to the window. I made a cave of my whole body, my coat, my cupped hands, around the mouth of that stove. I took the third match. I did not strike it fast. I struck it slow and steady, and it caught, and I held my breath until my lungs burned, and I touched it to the very smallest, driest curl of bark shaving I had peeled off with my thumbnail, and the bark caught, and then the bigger shaving caught off the bark, and then a thin little splinter of kindling caught off that, and there was fire. There was fire in the world again. I have seen fireworks burst over a lake on the 4th of July. I have seen the sun come up red and enormous over those mountains. I have seen a great many beautiful things in my long life. I have never, before or since, seen anything as beautiful as that one small orange flame taking hold in the cold black belly of that stove. I fed it the way you'd feed a sick child broth, a spoonful at a time, slow, patient, terrified of giving it too much and smothering it. And within a few minutes, there was real fire in there, real heat coming off the iron in waves, and that little dead cabin filled up with soft, trembling orange light for the first time in I don't know how many years. The shadows danced up the walls. The cold backed up into the corners and crouched there, beaten for now. Silas lifted his face toward the warmth, like a flower turning to follow the sun. Kay with my back against that warm iron stove, and I pulled my brother down out of the chair and into my lap, quilt and all, and I held him. I held him while the awful shaking slowed and then stopped. I held him while the blue went out of his lips and the color came creeping back into them, pink, alive. I held him while his breathing went long and deep and even, and his head got heavy against my shoulder, and he slept. I did not sleep that night. I watched the fire, and I fed it stick by careful stick, making my one night's wood last till the gray came up in the cracks of the walls. And somewhere in the deep middle of that night, with my brother's heart beating slow and steady against my arm, I made myself a promise. I said it out loud just under my breath, to the fire and the dark, and whatever might be listening in those woods. I will keep him alive. I don't care what this place is or who it belongs to. I don't care what it costs me. I will keep him alive, and as God is my witness, I will never let anyone send us away again. Never. Not ever again. I did not have the first idea that night of everything that promise was going to ask of me before the winter was through. By morning, the fire had burned down to 3 or 4 orange eyes glowing in the ash. Gray light came filtering through the pines outside, the soft, no-color light of a mountain morning before the sun clears the ridge. I eased my sleeping brother off my lap and onto the chair, and my legs had gone so stiff and cold beneath him I had to hold the wall to stand. Then I went out onto the little porch to see in daylight what we had stumbled into in the dark. It was both better and worse than I'd let myself hope. Better, because daylight showed me the bones of the place, and the bones were good. The cabin was small, but it sat square and true on its footing where it counted. The sag was all in the back, over a kind of lean-to woodshed tacked on later, and the main room stood honest. The garden rows ran along the south wall where they'd catch what winter sun there was. There was a stone chimney that hadn't cracked. Past the clearing, the pines went up and up into the morning fog, dark green and silver, and it was so quiet I could hear my own blood in my ears. No cars, no voices, no machinery, just the wind in the high branches and, somewhere, a single crow, saying its one hard word over and over. Worse, because daylight also let me count, with terrible clarity, exactly how little we had. Half a loaf of bread, gone hard as a hymnal, 30-some dollars. Two scratchy blankets and the clothes on our backs. And winter coming down out of those mountains, like a great slow hand starting to close. The door opened behind me, and Silas came out, rubbing his eyes, the quilt still around his shoulders like a cape. He was steady on his feet. He had color. He was alive, and I had kept him alive. And I will tell you, I had to turn away and look hard at the trees for a minute so he wouldn't see what that did to my face. And then he did the thing he does. He went still. He tilted his head, the way a deer does when it's heard something you haven't. "Wren," he said. "Listen." I listened. Wind. The crow. "I don't hear anything, baby." "No," he said, patient with me, under that. Listen under it. And then I did hear it. Down underneath the wind. Faint and steady and constant. A sound that was not the wind and was not the dripping of frost off the branches. It was water. Running water. We followed it. Around the back of the cabin, past the sagging woodshed, into a tangle of old tree roots and rotten moss-covered boards laid flat over the ground. I pulled the boards aside, and they came up easy, soft as bread, and underneath them was a door. A door set right into the side of the slope, made of heavy old planks, with iron hinges and earth banked up around it. A root cellar, dug back into the hillside the way the old homesteaders built them, to keep food cool in summer and from freezing in winter. I lifted it. The hinges groaned, and a breath of air rolled up out of the dark, but it wasn't the dead cold air of the cabin. It was different. It had moisture in it. It had life. Silas grabbed a fistful of my sleeve. "What if somebody's down there?" he whispered. I didn't have a good answer for that. So I did the only thing a big sister can do. I went down first. It was a small stone room dug back into the hill, the walls weeping cold and damp under my hand. Wooden shelves ran down both sides, most of them bare, a few dusty mason jars catching what light came down the steps, some old potatoes gone soft and sprouting pale eyes in the corners, and at the very back, where the living rock of the hillside came through the wall, water ran. It just ran, all on its own, clear and cold and steady, trickling out of a seam in the stone and falling into a shallow basin, worn smooth as a bowl by years and years of it. A spring. A live spring, running winter and summer, the kind of thing the old people used to build their whole lives around, because water that comes up out of the ground free and clean is the difference between a homestead and a grave. I knelt down and cupped my hands and drank, and the water was so cold it made my teeth ache up into my skull, and it was the sweetest thing I have ever tasted in my life, before or since. And something in my chest, something that had been wound up tight as a fist since the moment Vernon stood in his door. For the first time I felt the smallest, most fragile thread of hope, thin as spider silk. Water, real, live, year-round water. You can build a whole life around water. From the top of the cellar steps, Silas's voice came down to me, small and careful. "Wren, are we going to be okay down here? Really?" I looked at that clear water coming straight out of the solid rock, steady as a pulse, steady as a thing that had been keeping its promise for 100 years and meant to keep it for 100 more. And I made him a promise to match it. "Yeah," I said, "we are. I mean it. We are not going to die out here, Silas. You hear me?" I cupped up another handful and drank, sealing it. Not if I can help it. Not if I have one breath left in my body. I want you to remember those words. Not if I can help it. I want you to hold on to them. Because I had no idea, kneeling there in the dark, drinking that cold, sweet water, how far I was going to have to go to keep them. I straightened up, and as I did, my eyes finished adjusting to the gloom, and I saw something against the side wall of the cellar that turned my fragile new thread of hope cold and tight in my belly all over again. A kut, a folding cot, the kind soldiers use, the kind they sell at the surplus store in town, set up against the wall. And it was not gray and rotten and webbed over like everything else down here. The canvas was sound. There was a wool blanket folded neat on the end of it, and the blanket was not moldy, not chewed by mice. It was clean. And on the packed dirt floor beside the cot sat a tin coffee can, and in the can were cigarette butts, and beside the can lay a half-empty pack of cigarettes with the cellophane still bright and crinkled and new. Somebody had been sleeping down here. Not years ago. Not back when the garden rows were tended. Recently, the back of my neck went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the spring or the season. I could hear my brother shifting his weight at the top of the stairs, up in the daylight, waiting on me, trusting me to come back up and tell him everything was fine. This place was not empty. Somebody used it, somebody was using it, and somebody, sometime, was going to come back. And we had nowhere else in this whole wide, cold world to go. Let me stop right here just for a moment, because I want you to feel exactly what I felt kneeling in that cellar. We had just found water, we had found shelter and a stove and one night of fire. We had found the first truly safe things in weeks and weeks of being unsafe. And in the very same breath, in the very same minute, I found the proof that none of it might be ours to keep. That somebody could come walking out of those trees and take it all back. If you have ever in your own life found something you needed with your whole soul and then realized almost at once that you might have to fight to hold on to it, then I think you know precisely where my heart was sitting that morning. Stay close to me now, because what came next is the part of this story I have never once been able to set down. I didn't tell Silas about the cot. I want to be honest with you, because there is no point in my telling you any of this if I'm not going to tell it straight. I should have told him. He was 10 years old, not a baby, and he was sharper than most grown men I have known in my life. He could read me like the front page, but I was 17, and I was carrying both our lives on my back through a winter I wasn't sure we'd survive, and I made the choice that older sisters and mothers and grandmothers have been making since the beginning of time. I decided to carry the fear by myself. I decided he would have enough to carry without it. So I climbed back up out of that cellar with a smile pushed onto my face, and I covered the door over with the boards just as it had been, and I told my brother the spring was good news. The best news. I told him it meant we'd never go thirsty, that we could wash, that water was the whole foundation of staying. And all of that was true. I just left out the cot, and the clean blanket, and the bright pack of cigarettes, and the cold feeling they'd put in me. I tucked those down inside myself next to all the other things I wasn't saying, and I went to work. Because that is the other half of being the older one, the half nobody warns you about. You can be frightened half to death and still get up in the cold and work. The two things live side by side inside you, the fear and the working, and neither one cancels the other out. Anybody who ever told you that courage means not being afraid has never once been hungry and cold with something small and precious depending on them. Courage isn't the absence of the fear. Courage is the woodpile you build with shaking hands. So I built the woodpile day after day those first weeks. I built our life one small mercy at a time. I found an old axe leaning in the corner of the lean-to, the head gone orange with rust, but the handle sound and smooth, worn to fit a hand, and every single morning before the light was even full in the trees, I'd take that axe out into the woods and bring back whatever I could carry. Deadfall, mostly in the beginning branches, the storms had already brought down, dry on the underside where they'd lain up off the wet ground, dry under the thick pine canopy where the rain came through thin. I'd haul it back across both my shoulders, staggering, and stack it by the south wall. My hands blistered the first week. Then the blisters tore open and wept, and I cried over them in private where Silas couldn't see. Then they scabbed, and then they went hard, and by the end of the second week, I had hands I didn't recognize, working hands, a woman's hands instead of a girl's. And the strangest thing I found, I was proud of them. I'd look at them by the fire at night and feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt useful. I felt like I was good for something. Silas stayed near the cabin. In the beginning, I hated to leave him, even for the hour it took to gather wood. I'd come back half running, certain I'd find the door open and him gone. But he found his own ways to be useful, and that, more than anything, is what saved us, the two of us, each carrying our own share of the weight. He washed every one of those dusty mason jars in spring water until they shone like new, and lined them up proud on the shelf. He found a tin of dried beans gone hard as gravel, and he sat by the fire and sorted them one by one, the good from the ruined, patient as a little monk, for the better part of 2 days. He gathered armful after armful of dry grass and pine needles and packed them into every crack and gap around the door and the windows, weatherproofing the place the way some old instinct seemed to teach him, nobody having to tell him little things. But I have lived long enough now to tell you the truth about survival, and it is this: there is no big thing. There is no grand gesture that saves you. There is only 10,000 little things done in the cold, on purpose, on time, day after day after day. The big things are made out of the little ones. That's all they've ever been. One afternoon, I followed the spring's outflow downhill, farther than I'd gone before, picking my way over the icy rocks, and I found where it joined up with a narrow creek running fast between mossy boulders. And in the still pools behind those boulders, hanging in the cold, clear water like little ghosts, were fish, brook trout, small but real, and alive, and food. It took me most of that day, and a great deal of language my mother would not have approved of, and 2 falls into water cold enough to stop your heart. But I came back to that cabin in the falling dark, with 2 trout wrapped up in the front of my jacket, and I will carry the look on my brother's face to my grave. "You caught those?" he said, and there was something in his voice I had not heard since before our mother got sick. It was wonder, just pure, plain, child's wonder. We cooked them slow on the flat top of the stove, with a little wild onion I'd grubbed up from the frozen edge of the old garden, and the smell of that filled the whole cabin and seemed to push the last of the deep cold right out through the cracks in the walls. And for the first time, that little broken down place did not smell like a hiding spot or a tomb. It smelled like a kitchen. It smelled like a home where people lived and cooked and waited for each other to come in out of the dark. Silas ate with his eyes half shut, the way you do when something tastes so good you can't spare the attention for seeing. "Ren," he said, very serious, the way he says important things, "I think this is the best food in the whole entire world." It was 2 little bony trout and a wild onion shared between 2 starving children, but I have eaten in fine places since in my long life. And I will tell you, looking back across all of it, that my brother was exactly right. It was. I want to stop and ask you something, and I think I'm asking the mothers, especially now, and the grandmothers, the women who have fed people their whole lives long. Do you remember a meal like that one? A meal that was almost nothing at all by the measure of the world, but it was everything because of who you shared it with or because of what you'd come through just to get to it? The plainest food that somehow became a feast? I would love for you to tell me about it down in the comments, because I have come to believe that the smallest plate of food shared with the right person holds more love in it than the grandest table set for strangers. Tell me yours. I'll be reading. Now, let me go on, because the days were getting colder and the work was changing. The work was changing, It had started out as the work of staying alive that one day. Now it became the work of staying alive in January, in February, in the deep teeth of a Montana winter, and that is a far larger and more frightening thing. I patched the holes in the roof. I'm not too proud to tell you I was terrified of it up on that sagging roof in the wind, with the ground a long way down, prying loose the rotten cedar shakes, and nailing up boards I'd salvaged off the collapsed lean-to. I didn't have a hammer. I drove every nail with a smooth river rock that fit my palm, and I hit my own thumb more times than I could count, and I cursed Vernon and the bank and the cold and God himself up there on that roof. And then I climbed down and looked at what I'd done, and it was ugly and it was crooked, and it would hold out the snow. I had made it with my own two hands, and it would hold. I stacked the growing wood pile high against the south wall and rigged a roof over it out of torn feed sacks. I found stiff and frozen in the shed so the wood would stay dry. Silas and I cleared the old dead garden rows together, on our knees, pulling out the frost-killed weeds with our cold bare fingers. And we found down in the cellar that handful of sprouting seed potatoes, and we did not eat them, hungry as we were, because I knew enough to know what they could become. We set them carefully aside in a cool, dark corner, and we banked the cleared garden rows over with straw and pine needles and laid the frozen earth to rest, so the ground would be ready and rich for them come the spring. That was an act of faith, if you want to know the truth. Setting aside food you could eat today to plant in a spring you weren't sure you'd live to see. But I think faith is mostly that. Faith is banking the rows in the dead of winter. I built a rain barrel, too, out of an old steel drum I rolled up from the creek, set under the corner of the roof to catch the runoff and the snow melt. And little by little, week by week, the forgotten place changed. Smoke rose from that stone chimney every single evening now. Warm light glowed gold behind the patched-up window after dark. And anyone who came up that old logging road, though nobody did, would no longer have seen an abandoned cabin dying in the woods. They'd have seen a home, a poor one, a small one, but a home, lived in, fought for, kept. And then, one freezing afternoon, while I was prying a rotten board off the inside of the kitchen wall to replace it with a sound one, something fell out of the wall and landed at my feet. An envelope, yellowed, folded over once. The particular kind of old that paper only gets when it's been hidden a long, long time, away from light and air. Somebody had tucked it down inside that wall, deep, on purpose. The way you hide a thing you cannot quite bring yourself to throw away, but cannot quite bring yourself to carry either. I didn't open it right then. I don't fully know why. It felt like a thing you did by firelight, after dark, with the wind pressed up against the glass. So I carried it in my coat pocket all the rest of that day, and I felt the weight of it there, light as it was, all afternoon. That night, after Silas had eaten and curled up under the quilt by the stove, I worked the old paper open. The folds had gone soft and brown, and one of them tore a little as it came apart. Inside was a single sheet, written close on both sides in a hand that shook the hand of someone old, or someone sick, or both. The ink had faded to brown in places, but most of it I could still read by the firelight. It was a letter from a man. His name was at the bottom, Walter Brennan. He had lived in this cabin, he wrote, alone the last of his years. He wrote about the forest, and about the spring that never failed him, and about the garden, and about the apple trees down the hill, apple trees. I read that twice, hungry as I was, and filed it away. He wrote about the winters and how they had gotten harder and longer every single year after his wife passed on. He wrote about being old and being alone in a way that put a hand around my throat and squeezed, because being old and alone in the cold with nobody was the exact thing I had been most afraid of in this world, And here was a letter from a man who had lived that very fear all the way down to its bottom. And then, near the end, in writing that shook even worse than the rest, as though it had cost him something to set it down, was one line. And it stopped me cold, and I read it over and over until I had it by heart, and I have it by heart still. If someone finds this place someday, please live better here than I did. I looked up from the page. Silas was awake, watching me from under the quilt, and he was looking around that little firelit room with a different face than he'd worn a minute before, not frightened. Not even sad, exactly. Careful, almost reverent. The face of a boy who has just understood that he is a guest in someone's house, and more than that, that the someone had wanted him there, had hoped for him. This was his, Silas said softly. We're living in his house, Wren. Yeah, I said. My voice didn't come out quite right. We are. Do you think he minds us being here? I looked down at that shaking line of brown ink. Live better here than I did. No, I said, and I found that I believed it all the way down. No, baby. I think he'd be glad. I think it's about the only thing in this world that could have made him glad. That letter changed something between us and the cabin. Before, it had been a place we were hiding in. After, it was a place we were keeping. And there is all the difference in the world between those two things, the difference between borrowing a coat against the cold and being handed one, looked in the eye, and told it's yours now, wear it well. We started to take care of that cabin the way you take care of a thing that's been given to you in trust by someone who hoped for you before they ever knew your name. So when I found the apple trees 3 days later, it felt almost as though Walter Brennan himself had reached up out of the ground to point the way. It was a gray morning, and I'd followed the broken fence line farther down the slope than I'd ever gone, and the pines opened all at once into a clearing I hadn't known was there. An orchard. Old apple trees in crooked rows, their branches grown wild and tangled after years with no one to prune them. Most of the fruit had long since fallen and gone to brown rot in the high dead grass. But not all of it. Not all. High up, out of the reach of the deer, hanging stubborn against the gray autumn sky, there were still apples, small and hard and red. Real fruit, real food. I climbed those trees like a girl half my age. I filled the whole front of my jacket, and at the far edge of the orchard, where the clearing met the trees again, I found something better still, a great old walnut tree, enormous, and the ground beneath it was thick with nuts in their split green husks, more than the two of us could have carried in a week of trips. Walnuts keep. That was the thing that made me sit right down in the cold grass and put my face in my hands for a minute. Walnuts keep all winter, the kind of food that gets a body through to spring. We roasted apples on the stovetop that night until they went soft and sweet and dark, and we set the walnuts in pans to dry beside the woodpile, and that little cabin smelled like a kitchen on Thanksgiving morning. And my brother laughed, out loud, a real laugh, surprised out of him, the first one since the night we'd walked out of Vernon's door into the dark. I had to look hard at the fire again. I went to sleep that night, warm, with my brothers even breathing beside me and the smell of apples in the air, believing for the first time, all the way through, that we were going to make it. I was not wrong, exactly. We did make it, but I was early. Because the winter was not done with us. The winter had hardly started. Forgive me, I have to stop here a moment, because the part that comes next is the part where everything we had built so carefully came apart in a single night, and even now, all these years later, my hands want to shake when I tell it. If you've come this far down the road with me, and I'm so grateful that you have, I'm going to ask you for one small thing. Reach down and hit that subscribe button so this story can find more women who need to hear it. And then tell me something in the comments. At this exact point in the story, believing we were finally safe, finally going to make it, what would you have done if you'd walked out one morning and found what I found? And tell me this, because I truly want to know. Have you ever in your life had to fight to hold on to something that was rightfully yours when it felt like the whole wide world was lined up against you? Your story might be the very thing somebody scrolling past tonight most needs to read. Now, let me tell you about the morning I found the footprints. It was 3 mornings after the orchard. I went out at first light to the lean-to where we'd been storing the dried trout and the walnuts and the best of the apples, our whole winter larder, everything we had worked for. The door of the lean-to stood open, and inside the shelf was bare. For a moment I just stood there, not understanding, my mind refusing it. Then it came down on me all at once. The food was gone, all of it. Weeks of work. The walnuts that would have carried us to spring, the dried fish, the hard-won apples, gone in a single night, every bit of it. My first thought was an animal, a bear, gone into a clearing out before its winter sleep, but there were no claw marks anywhere. The door had not been broken, or forced it had been opened, and then pulled shut again, by a hand, by fingers and a thumb. And in the soft mud just outside, glazed now with the morning's frost, were the prints. Boots, a man's boots, bigger than my own, the tread worn smooth on the heel, the way boots wear when a man has walked a very long way in them with nowhere particular to go. And I thought of the cot in the cellar, the clean folded blanket, the bright new pack of cigarettes, and the cold knot I'd been carrying down in my belly for weeks. The one I'd been pretending wasn't there pulled itself tight and hard. I did not sleep right for days after that. Every night I'd walk the trees around the cabin twice before I wired the door shut with a length of old fence wire. I kept the axe within reach of where I slept. I told Silas it was so I could split kindling first thing in the morning without hunting for it, but I think he knew better. He'd gone quiet again, the deep kind, the kind that came down over him like a lid. And then, on a gray afternoon with the first true snow of the year spitting and swirling down through the pines, I came up from the creek with a string of fish, and there was a man standing in the middle of our clearing. He was tall and thin in the way that comes from going without, not from how a man is built, maybe 30 years old, though something had aged him hard past that, the cold and the road and whatever else. He had several days of dark beard and eyes that moved too fast, never lighting anywhere, the eyes of a man who's used to being moved along. He was standing dead center in our clearing, looking at our cabin, at the smoke rising from our chimney, at everything we'd made, and I could not read his face at all. Through the window, I saw Silas go still as a stone. I set down my fish. I put myself square between the man and that window, between the man and my brother. I had the axe in my hand, down low, not raised, but there. My heart was slamming so hard against my ribs I was sure he could see it move my coat. "This is private property," I said, and my voice came out level and hard, steadier than any part of me felt, and I was grateful to it, that voice, for not betraying me. The man looked at me. He looked, slow, at the cabin behind me, at the smoke, at the neat woodpile under its cover. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out rough and rusty, like a gate that hadn't been opened in a while. "You got that right," he said. "It's private property. Thing is, it's mine." His name was Roy. He told me, standing there in the falling snow, that the cabin belonged to his family, that he'd been coming back to it for a couple of years now, on and off, whenever he had nowhere else in the world to be, and that he'd been the one sleeping down in the cellar, before the deep cold drove him out of the hills and down toward town to look for work that never lasted longer than a week. He said he'd come back up the mountain expecting an empty cabin, and found smoke pouring out of his own family's chimney and 2 children living inside. "So, the way I see it," he said, and there was an edge in it, "you two are the ones trespassing, not me." I won't pretend to you that I wasn't afraid. I was. A grown man twice my size, standing between my little brother and the one thing keeping him out of a Montana winter. But underneath the fear, something harder was waking up and stretching. Something I hadn't fully known was in me until that exact moment. We didn't take a single thing that was being used, I said. This place was dying. The roof was caving in. That window was busted out. The garden was dead and gone to weed. Nobody was keeping it, nobody. We have put 6 weeks of work into this cabin. We made it live again, with our own hands. I took a breath, and I let the harder thing come up into my voice. And you took our food, every bit of it. The walnuts, the fish, the apples, all of it, in one night. That was you, wasn't it? He had the grace at least to look away from me into the trees. A man's got to eat, he muttered. So does a 10-year-old boy, I said. So does my brother. He's right there in that window. You took his food, too. You took the food out of a sick child's mouth so you could eat it yourself in the woods. And I'll tell you, something crossed that man's worn-out face when I said it. Just a flicker, there and gone, quick as a fish turning in dark water. But I caught it. I have spent my life since learning to read faces, and I learned the first hard lesson of it right there in that clearing. What crossed Roy's face was shame, plain human shame. We stood there, the two of us, in the falling snow, in a standoff that neither of us had the first idea how to end. By every law I knew of, and I didn't know many, but I knew that much the man had the better claim. It was his family's land. I had no paper. I had nothing but 6 weeks of work and a child in a window. By the law, he could have put us out into the snow right then, and there'd have been nobody in 40 miles to say he couldn't. But there was Silas in the window, and there was Walter Brennan's letter folded in my coat pocket, the paper of it almost warm against me. Live better here than I did. And I knew, the way you know a thing in your bones long before you can build an argument for it, that whatever the law said, this was not going to be a place where a frightened child got put out into the dark and the cold, not while there was breath in my body. Not ever again. I had made a promise to a fire and a stove and the dark, and I meant to keep it. You can claim it all day long, I said. Maybe the law is even on your side. I don't know. But you are not putting my brother out into that cold. I have already seen what that looks like. I held him through our first night out here, and his lips went blue, and I thought I was going to lose him before morning, and I am telling you I will not live through that twice. So if you want this cabin so bad, you're going to have to carry me out of it first, and I'll fight you the whole way. Roy looked at me for a long, long time. The snow came down between us. Then his eyes went slow to the cabin again, to the patched and crooked roof, to the woodpile, neat under its frozen feed sacks, to the cleared and banked-up garden rows sleeping under their blanket of straw, to the smoke going straight up into the gray, to all of it, to 6 weeks of 2 children's hands. You did all that, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Just the two of you, a girl and a little boy. Just the two of us, I said. There was never anybody else. There's only ever been the two of us. He nodded, slow. And he didn't leave. But he didn't come a step closer either. He just stood there in the deepening snow as the gray light started to fail around us. A man with nowhere on God's earth to go, looking at a home that 2 abandoned children had built up out of the very thing he had let fall down into ruin. And that was the moment my brother started to scream. I ran. I dropped everything and I ran, and I hit that door and threw it open. Silas was down on the floor by the stove, and his face was wrong, flushed dark red and slack at the same time, sweat standing out on his forehead, and when I got my hand to him, he was burning. Burning like the side of the stove itself. He'd been fighting a cold for days, that little rattling cough, and I had heard it, and I had told myself it was nothing, just a chill, because I could not afford for it to be anything more. And now it had turned, the way these things turn, fast and vicious, into something with teeth. Silas, Silas, baby, look at me, look at your sister, look at me now. His eyes wouldn't fix on mine. They rolled and floated and slid away. He was shaking, but it wasn't cold, it was the fever shaking him, and he was saying words that weren't words, soft, urgent nonsense, talking to someone who wasn't there. Talking, I realized, with a cold drop straight through me, to Mama, and I had nothing. Do you understand? I had nothing at all. No medicine, no doctor, no telephone, no road I could carry a sick child down in the dark, in a snowstorm that was now coming on in dead earnest, the wind rising, the spitting flakes turning to a driving white wall. The nearest help was 40 miles down a track that was filling with snow even as I knelt there. I was 17 years old and my brother was dying in my arms for the second time in 2 months, and there was nothing I could do. I have never in my whole life, before or since, been so afraid. I did the only thing I knew how to do. I got him up onto the cot we'd made by the stove, and I soaked a cloth in the cold spring water, and I started sponging him down, his forehead, his neck, his thin chest, trying to pull that terrible heat down out of him. And it wasn't working, or it wasn't working fast enough. The storm was screaming around the corners of the cabin now, the whole little building shuddering with it, and I was crying openly, the way I never let myself cry, and trying to keep the sound of it out of my voice so he wouldn't hear his sister come apart. And then, behind me, the door opened. Roy stood in it, snow-caked white across his shoulders, in his beard, in his hair. He had not gone. Through all of it, he had not gone down the mountain. He'd been out there in the clearing, in the storm. I think if you had asked me 1 single hour before that, I would have told you I would sooner have died than ask that man for anything at all. But I am going to tell you something I have learned, something it took a sick child to teach me. There is a thing that happens to a person's pride when someone they love is burning up and slipping away in their arms. The pride doesn't fade, it doesn't shrink. It simply, all at once, stops mattering. It falls away like it was never anything but a coat you'd been wearing, and underneath it there's just the love and the need standing there naked in the cold. Please, I said, to Roy, to the man I'd threatened with an axe an hour before, please. He's so hot I can't bring it down. I've tried everything. Please, I don't know what to do. Please help me, please. Roy crossed that room in 3 long strides. He went down on his knees by the cot, and he put the back of his rough hand against my brother's forehead, and his whole face changed. Willow bark, he said. Fast, low, certain. There's a stand of it down along the creek. By the big rocks you'll know it. And yarrow. The gray-green stuff, feathery, grows low. It'll still be there under the snow if you dig. My grandmother. He stopped. Something moved across his face. He started again. I know how to bring a fever down. I've done it. I watched her do it 100 times when I was a boy. You hear me? I have done this before, and it works. Get water boiling on that stove. Now, I'll be back. And before I could say a word, he was gone, back out the door, into the howling white. Let me stop the story right here, just for a heartbeat. Because I know in my heart that some of you watching this right now are mothers and grandmothers. And I know that you know this exact feeling I'm describing. The feeling of a little one burning up with fever in the deep of the night, and no help anywhere in sight. And the helplessness of it, the terror of it, the way it hollows you right out. Some of you have lived through that very night. And I know that some of you also know this other thing, this thing I was about to learn, that sometimes, help comes walking through the door, in the shape of the very last person on earth you ever expected it from. Hold that thought with me now. because Roy went out into that blizzard, and what he carried back through that door, and what he told me by the firelight in the long hours after it changed everything I thought I knew about him, and everything I thought I knew about how the world works. Stay with me. He was gone 20 minutes. They were the longest 20 minutes of my life. The storm was so loud that I could not have heard him call out for help if he'd needed it, could not have heard him fall, could not have heard anything at all over that screaming wind. I boiled the water and I sponged my brother and I waited and I prayed my second prayer of that whole hard autumn. And then Roy came back, snow packed to a crust across his whole front, his bare hands raw and cracked and bleeding at the knuckles, frozen claws but cupped in them, held against his chest like the most precious thing in the world, a fistful of stripped willow bark, and a clutch of gray-green yarrow leaves he'd clawed up out of the frozen creek bank with his bare fingers. And he showed me how to steep the bark and the leaves, how to judge the strength of it, how to cool it to where a sick child could take it. And then, all through that long screaming night, the two of us, strangers, enemies, an hour before spooned that bitter tea between my brother's cracked lips, a little at a time, a few drops more. We took turns, one of us sponging the heat away, the other lifting his head and getting the tea into him. Hour after hour after hour, while the blizzard threw itself against the little cabin and tried with all its strength to tear the patched roof off and get at the three of us inside. And somewhere in the deep, dark, exhausted middle of that night, with Silas finally sleeping easier between us, his breathing gone less ragged, the awful heat of him just beginning to break, Roy told me his story. He told it to the fire, mostly not to me, in a low, rough voice, the way men tell the truth when they can't look at you while they do it. He hadn't lied to me. Not exactly. The Brennans were his family. Walter had been his great-uncle, his grandmother's older brother, but Roy had been thrown out of his own home as a young man, not much older than I was then. A father who drank and got mean when he drank. A stepmother who'd wanted him gone from the day she married in. And so he'd left or been driven off. It came to the same thing, and he had been running ever since. Drinking like his father before him, the way the bottle gets passed down a family like a cursed heirloom, drifting from town to town, sleeping rough, working when there was work, and going without when there wasn't. He'd come up to Walter's old cabin the very first time, 2 winters back, because it was the one single place in all his memory that had ever felt safe. He'd spent one summer up here as a boy, just one, sent to stay with the old man while things were bad at home, and that one summer with Walter in this cabin was the only time in his whole life he had ever felt wanted, ever felt safe, ever felt like he belonged somewhere. He was kind to me, Roy said to the fire. Walter, the only one who ever was back then when I was a kid, taught me the willow bark, the yarrow, how to read the woods, treated me like I was worth teaching. His jaw worked. He was quiet a moment, and I didn't even come to his funeral. Didn't even know there'd been one till months after it was over. I was off drunk in some other town when they put the only man who was ever good to me in the ground. He drew a long breath. I come back up here because I got no place else in this world to be. Same as you, I figure. The exact same as you two. And there it was, the whole shape of it, laid out in the firelight. The thing I had been so afraid of, the man, the stranger, the enemy, the one who'd come out of the trees to take it all away from us. He was no villain at all. He never had been. He was just another soul that the world had picked up and thrown out into the cold, crawling back, the same as we had, to the one and only place that had ever once held him gently. I didn't know, that night, whether to hate him or to grieve for him. In the end, I found I could not manage either one. So I just took the cup of cooling tea and held it out to him across my sleeping brother, and Roy took it and lifted Silas's head in one big, careful hand and got another spoonful into him. And the two of us, who had been ready to fight to the death over a broken-down cabin that afternoon, kept each other's family alive through the longest night of that winter. Outside, the snow kept falling and falling, and by the time the gray light finally came creeping back into the cracks of the walls, it had buried the old logging road completely, and the orchard, and the clearing, and the three of us together deep under the white. The blizzard lasted 2 full days. The snow buried the old logging track so deep you couldn't have found it without knowing where to dig. The wind shook the cabin so hard that Silas, weak as a newborn but with the fever finally broken, would wake in the dark and reach out for my hand, just to know it was there, and I would give it to him, and he would sleep again. But the roof held. I want you to hear that. The roof I had patched with salvaged boards and a smooth river rock for a hammer, the roof I had cursed and bled over it, held. Not one board gave way. The fire stayed alive, the three of us feeding it in shifts, never letting it die down past a bed of red coals. And little by little, hour by hour, the fever let my brother go, and the color came back, and on the morning of the second day he sat up on his own and asked, in a small croaky voice, whether there was anything to eat, and I laughed and cried at the same time, which is a thing I did not know a body could do until that morning. Then, on the second night, while the wind was still screaming, we ran clean out of wood. The main pile was buried under a drift taller than I was, and the storm was too fierce to dig it out, and we needed something to burn, or the fire would die and the cold would come in and find us. And Roy remembered the old tool shed dug back into the slope behind the cabin, where Walter had kept things, where there might be something dry to burn. The two of us dug down to that shed door through snow up past our knees, and we hauled it open, and we went in with the lantern. And there, pushed back into the driest corner, under a fall of old tools and a gray drape of cobweb, was a box, a strong box, steel, dented, gone dull, with a hasp, and a little padlock, long since rusted shut. Roy took a chisel from the shed wall and broke the lock, and we carried the box inside to the firelight, and the three of us crowded around it on the floor, even Silas, wrapped in his quilt. And what was inside was not money, and I will be honest, some greedy, hopeful part of me had been praying it would be money, enough money, to make all our problems disappear. It was paper, the deed to the land, first, right on top, 63 acres, the cabin, the orchard, the spring, the creek, all of it, in the name of Walter Brennan, free and clear, no bank, no lien, nothing owed against the land itself. And underneath the deed, a single sheet, handwritten, signed at the bottom, and signed again by 2 witnesses, a will, Walter Brennan's last will and testament, made out in his own shaking hand. And he had left the property, and I am going to tell you the words exactly because I have carried them in my heart every day from that night to this one. He had left it to whoever should come to this land in true need of it more than I, for a home ought rightly to belong to the one who will love it and keep it. I sat back on my heels in the firelight. Roy went very, very still beside me, because here was the thing, sitting right there between us on the floor. By blood, Roy had the better claim he was a Brennan, the old man's own great-nephew. But the will didn't say one word about blood. It said need, and it said love, and it said keep. And there we were, all 3 of us, on that cold floor, and every one of us had needed this place, and loved this place, and kept this place, with everything we had in us. But that wasn't even the part that finally broke me open. That was still coming. Because at the very bottom of that steel box, underneath the deed and the will, wrapped careful in a square of oilcloth, gone soft and yellow with the years, was a bundle of letters. dozens of them, tied together with a faded piece of string, and every single one of them was addressed in Walter Brennan's shaking hand to the same person, to a woman named Eleanor Vance. I knew that name. I knew it the way you know the sound of your own heart. I knew it the way you know your mother's voice in a crowded room. Eleanor Vance was my mother's name, her name before she married my father. Eleanor Vance was the name written in faded blue ink on the back of the one single photograph I owned of her as a young woman, a photograph I had carried in the bottom of that broken backpack all the way up the mountain. My hands started to shake. The letters trembled in them. I need to stop here. I'm sorry. Just for a moment. Because some stories you cannot tell straight through without stopping to catch your breath, and this is the place in mine where I have to stop every single time. If you're feeling right now even a little of what I felt sitting on that cold floor with my mother's name in my lap, would you do something for me? Just type one word down in the comments. Type the word here, just so I know you're still with me in this moment, that I'm not sitting on that floor alone. Because what I worked out in the next few minutes with those letters shaking in my hands, that is the thing this entire story was always about. Let me tell you, take my hand, and let me tell you, they had never been sent. Every single one of those letters. Walter had written them, and folded them, and addressed them in his careful hand, and some of them he had even put stamps on, and every single one of them had come back to him, stamped across the front in red, in the cold language of the post office. Return to sender. Address unknown. My mother had moved, you see, and moved again and again, the way the poor and the frightened and the proud always move, staying one step ahead of the rent, ahead of the bad memories, ahead of whatever was chasing them. And every time my mother moved, this old man's letters had failed to find her and had come back to him, alone in his cabin in the pines, and he had kept them. He had not thrown a single one away. He had wrapped them in oilcloth and locked them in a steel box and kept them all. I read them by the firelight while Roy held my brother, held my baby. I mean Silas, but he was my baby too. He had always been my baby, and the words came up off the faded pages in that shaking hand. He was my grandfather, my mother's father. Eleanor was his daughter, his only child. And they had had a falling out when she was young, the kind of falling out that families have and then can't find their way back from hard words said in anger, a door slammed, a silence that went on too long to break. She had left, and he had been too proud to chase after her, and then, when the pride wore off, too ashamed of his own pride to try. And by the time he finally tried, by the time he sat down in this cabin and started writing the letters, it was already too late. She was gone into the wide, poor country with a baby of her own, and then two, moving and moving, and his letters could never catch her. He wrote to her about the cabin, about the apple trees, about the spring. He wrote about the weather, the way you do when you can't find the words for the big things. And in letter after letter, he wrote that he was sorry, that he had been a stubborn old fool, that he forgave her for whatever he'd imagined she'd done, and begged her to forgive him for what he knew he had. And in the last letter, the one on the very top of the bundle, dated the spring before he died, he had written this. I read it 100 times that night. I can close my eyes right now and see it. I would give over every last day I have remaining to me, Eleanor, for just 1 single hour. 1 hour to look at your face and tell you that I never once stopped loving you, not for a day, not for an hour. And to meet the children I am certain in my heart you must have by now, my grandchildren, whom I will likely never know. I keep a place for them here. The cabin, the land, all of it. I keep it ready. I keep a place for them always, in case they should ever, by some grace of God, find their way home. I keep a place for them here. He kept a place for us. He didn't know our names, he didn't know our faces, he didn't even know for certain that we existed at all. But he had hoped that we did, with everything left in his old broken heart, and he had kept a place for us. And then, when his time came, in his will, he had given that place to whoever should come in need of it. And we came out of all the wide and frozen country, out of all the roads we could have walked the night. Vernon shut his door. His own grandchildren came stumbling up that logging track in the dark, half dead, and found the broken door and shouldered it open and lit his cold stove and ate his apples and drank from his spring and read his letter hidden in the wall and slept under his roof every single night. And we never knew, never once knew through all of it, that we had come home. I have wondered every day of my life since whether my mother knew. Whether, somewhere, somehow, in a way I will never be able to explain or prove, she steered us up that road. Two children with nowhere to go, and out of every direction in the world, we turned up the one track that led to her father's door. I will never know for certain, but I will tell you what I choose to believe after all these years. I believe she sent us. I believe my mother and her father, the two of them too proud and too late in life, made it right at the very last through two lost children in the snow. I believe she walked us up that mountain. I will believe it until I die, and you will not talk me out of it, and I don't want you to try. I wept then. I am not ashamed to tell you. I sat on that cold floor and I wept the way a person weeps when something they never even knew they had lost is suddenly impossibly handed back to them. And Roy, the drifter, the drunk, the man I'd held an axe on, the man the world had thrown out exactly the way it had thrown us out, Roy reached over and put his big, rough, cracked hand on my shoulder, and he let me weep, and he did not say one single word. Because some things in this life do not have words, and the kindest thing one broken person can do for another is simply to stay and be there and not look away. Because here is what I understood. Sitting on that floor, I had spent my entire short, hard life believing that I belonged to nobody. An orphan twice over, a girl with a dead father and a dead mother and an uncle who could not keep her, handed down and let go and handed down again. I had believed, all the way to my bones, that the love had simply run out somewhere up the line before it ever got down to me. And it was not true. It had never, ever been true. Not for one single day of my life. There had been an old man up in these pines, keeping a place for me, hoping for me, loving a granddaughter he had never even met the whole entire time. This is the part I most wanted to share with you. Out of this whole long story, this is the part I drove all this way to give you. Because I know it in my heart that some of you watching me right now have felt the exact way I had felt my whole life. Like you belonged to no one. Like the love had run dry somewhere up the line before it ever made its way down to you. Like you came into this world already left behind. And I want to say to you tonight, the very thing those letters said to me on that cold floor, you may have been loved by someone you never even got to meet. The love may have been there the whole time, just out of your sight, waiting quietly in some house up a road you never knew to walk down. It does not always reach us, but that does not mean it was never there. I believe that now with my whole heart. Would you tell me down in the comments, have you ever found out late, too late maybe, that you were loved far more than you ever knew? I'll be reading every one. Now let me tell you how we kept it, because finding out it was ours and keeping it turned out to be two very different things. There was a problem. Of course there was. There is always one more cold morning to get through before the spring comes. In the bottom of that steel box, tucked under the will and the letters, there was one more piece of paper. A notice. Official, printed, cold, from the county. The property taxes had not been paid since before Walter died. The land, 63 acres, the cabin, the orchard, all of it was scheduled to be sold at the county tax sale to satisfy the debt. The amount owed was $1,100 even. And the notice gave a deadline, and the deadline was the last day of December. It was already the middle of December. We had $31 to our name. I read that notice 3 times by the firelight, and I felt the old cold come climbing back up into my stomach. We had just found out it was ours, that it had always been ours, kept and saved for us by a man who loved us, and in the very same breath, in the very same steel box, we had found out we were about to lose it. 63 acres, and the only true home I had ever known, sold off the courthouse steps to some stranger over a debt of $1,100 that I did not have, and could not in my wildest dreams imagine how to get. I will tell you the truth, because I have promised you the truth all the way through. I thought about giving up, just for a moment, sitting there in the dark with that notice in my hand. I thought about how much easier it would be to simply stop fighting, to let it go, to accept that good things were not for people like us, that we had had our miracle and now the bill was coming due. But then my brother, getting his strength back by the hour, looked up at me from his quilt with our mother's eyes in his pale little face, and he said, "We're not going to lose it, are we, Ren? Now that it's really ours, we're not going to have to leave." And I heard myself say the very same thing I had said down in that cellar on the morning we found the spring, the morning I first let myself believe we might live. "No," I said, "not if I can help it." So I helped it. With everything I had, I helped it. When the storm finally broke and the snow settled enough to travel, Roy and I left Silas wrapped warm by the fire, under strict orders not to so much as look sideways at the axe, and the two of us broke trail down off that mountain into the town of Cedar Hollow. It took the whole of a short winter day, the two of us wading and floundering through the drifts, taking turns breaking the trail. The first place we went was the feed store, because in a town that small, the feed store is the one place that the whole world passes through, sooner or later. The ranchers, the farmers, the lonely, the gossips, everyone. The woman behind the counter was named Della. She was 60 if she was a day, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a way of looking at a person over the top of them that took your full measure in about 2 seconds flat. I told her where we were staying and how we'd come there and whose cabin it had turned out to be. "Brennan," she said. She set her glasses down flat on the counter. "Honey, you are not going to stand there and tell me you're Walter Brennan's kin." "His granddaughter," I said. "I only just found out 2 nights ago. I didn't know he existed until 2 nights ago." And Della came around that counter, this woman I had never laid eyes on before in my life, and she took my cold face in both her warm, dry hands, and she looked at me for a long moment, and her eyes filled right up. "You've got Eleanor's chin," she whispered. "Lord have mercy on us all. You've got Eleanor's exact chin. He talked about that girl until the day he died. You know. Cried over her more than once, right here in this store. That sweet, proud, stubborn old man missing a daughter he didn't know how to find." She let go of my face and wiped her own eyes with the back of her wrist, brisk, almost angry at herself. All right then. Enough of that. You tell me what you need, child, right now." So I told her. The taxes, the $1,100, the deadline at the end of the month, 2 weeks away. Della picked her glasses back up off the counter and put them on, settling them on her nose with the air of a woman buckling on armor and going out to war. "Well," she said, "we certainly cannot have that. I have thought a great deal, in all the long years since, about why those people helped us the way they did. Strangers. People who owed me nothing. And I have come to believe it was this. A good town remembers its good people. And it had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for a chance to pay an old debt to a good man who had died before it could. Because they came. Once Della knew, the whole of Cedar Hollow knew by supper time, the way news travels in a place where every soul has known every other soul for 50 years. And they did not just feel sorry for us, they came up that mountain. There was a rancher named Hank Mercer. He must have been 80 years old. He came grinding up the half-broken track in an old truck with chains on all four tires, and he stood in our snowy clearing with his hat in his two hands, an old man, looking up at the smoke from our chimney. And he told me a story. He told me that back in the blizzard of '78, a storm folks in that country still spoke of in low voices his cattle had been caught out, and he'd have lost the whole herd, his entire living, everything, and Walter Brennan had ridden out into weather that killed two other men that same week and helped him drive those cattle down to shelter and never once asked for a thing in return. Never mentioned it again. Acted like it was nothing. Your grandfather saved my whole herd, Hank said, and his old voice cracked on it. Saved my livelihood, saved my family, is what he did. And I have been waiting near 40 years to find a way to pay that man back proper, and the stubborn old goat up and died on me before I could manage it. He cleared his throat hard. So you are going to let me pay it to you instead, young lady. And you are not going to stand here in the snow and argue with me about it, because I am far too old to be argued with, and I will simply outlast you. There was a young woman, too. Her name was Josie, and she was just about my own age, and she worked the counter down at the diner. She found me one afternoon sitting alone on the cold stone steps of the courthouse, working and reworking a column of numbers that simply would not add up to enough no matter how I pushed them. And she didn't say anything clever. She just sat herself right down beside me on that freezing step, close, shoulder to shoulder, and after a while she said, "You're Wren. I heard about you, about what you're doing up there." And then she said, "I think it's about the bravest thing I ever heard of in my life." And just like that, in a town where 2 weeks before I had known not one living soul, I had a friend my own age. Do you know what that is worth? When you are 17 years old and you have been so alone for so long that you've forgotten the sound of someone laughing with you instead of at you, it is worth more than the $1,100. I am not exaggerating to you. It was worth more. And there was a lawyer, an old man named Whitfield, with a little office up a flight of stairs over the hardware store, the steps worn down in the middle from 100 years of feet. He looked over Walter's will and the deed, holding the papers up close and pushing his glasses up his nose, and he said, "This is a valid testamentary instrument, properly witnessed, properly signed. It will stand." And then he said, "And I'll do the filing of it at no charge to you, young lady," because Walter Brennan's hands drew up my own father's will some 60 years ago in this very office. And that man never once in his life sent a bill to a soul he knew couldn't pay it. He peered at me over the glasses. "But I'll be straight with you, because you deserve straight. The county does not care one whit about a valid will if the back taxes aren't paid. Get me the $1,100 by the 31st, and this land is yours, held in trust until you're of age. Miss it by a single day, and all my filing in the world won't save it. Do you understand me?" I understood him. But here is the part of all this that I am the very proudest of, and I want to make sure I say it plain, because I do not want you to walk away thinking the town simply handed us a miracle and that was that. They did not. What they did was open the door. The walking through it that we had to do on our own 2 feet. And we did because we had the walnuts, a whole winter's worth, dried and ready, and far more than 2 children could ever eat, gathered before Roy ever took them, and gathered again after. And we had Walter's good standing timber, the deadfall, and a few marked trees that Roy knew exactly how to take without harming the land, because that was one more thing his grandmother had taught him back before the bottle took everything else away from him. And Roy was the only one of the 3 of us old enough and able enough to haul that down off the mountain and turn it into cash money. So that is what he did. Day after day, In the bitter cold, from dark to dark, the man who had once crept up to our shed and stolen the food out of a sick child's mouth worked himself to the bone to help us keep our home. He didn't say much about it. He never made a speech. But that was how he chose to pay back what he'd taken, not with words, not with apology, but with his own two raw and aching hands. And I came to understand that this is the truest kind of sorry there is. The kind you can hold in your hands. It still wasn't enough by itself. None of it was enough by itself. That was the lesson of it, I think. So let me tell you exactly how it added up, the way we counted it out, because the counting is the whole point. Hank Mercer put in $500 and would not hear one word said against it. The walnuts sold at the Saturday market in the church basement brought close to 200 more. Roy's timber, hauled down to the mill in the next town over, load by load, on a borrowed sledge, made nearly $400. And Della had set a mason jar up on the feed store counter on the very first day, without asking anyone's leave, with a piece of masking tape on it that just said Brennan in marker, and that jar got filled a quarter and a dollar at a time by people I had never met and never would, ranchers and farmers and old women and children, all winter long. And when we carried all of it down to Mr. Whitfield's office on the 30th day of December, one day before the deadline, and counted it all out together across his big desk in fives and in ones, and in a great heavy heap of quarters, it came to $1,240. The taxes were $1,100 even. We paid them with 1 day and $140 to spare. And because I was only 17 years old, too young by law, to hold the land in my own name, old Hank Mercer agreed to stand as our guardian on the paper, to hold it all in trust for Silas and me until I came of age. Though I expect, he said, with that dry old laugh of his, that it'll be you doing the raising of me and not the other way around. The cabin would be ours. The land would be ours. Walter Brennan's last wish, written out in his own shaking hand on a cold night before he died, would be honored down to the very letter. A home ought rightly to belong to the one who will love it and keep it. We loved it. God in heaven knows we loved it. And so it was ours. I want to tell you about one more morning, and then I promise I will let you go. It was the first truly clear morning after the new year. The storms had all moved off east into the high country, and the sky was that hard, bright, aching blue that you only ever get in the mountains in the deep of winter. A blue so clean, it almost hurts to look at. The snow lay over the whole world, new and unbroken and a foot deep, and it threw the sunlight back so bright I had to squint. I stepped out onto the porch with the axe over my shoulder, out of pure old habit, though we had wood enough now stacked and split to see us clear to spring and beyond, and I just stopped. And I stood there a minute and I looked. Smoke was rising straight up from our chimney into the still, cold blue air, a thin gray ribbon going up and up. The wood pile stood stacked neat and high under its cover. The garden rows lay sleeping under their blanket of snow, banked and waiting, holding the seed potatoes safe for the spring planting. Down the hill I could just see the tops of the apple trees, black and bare and patient against the snow, dreaming of May. And across the clearing, written fresh in the new snow, were tracks. Deer and the neat little stitched line of a fox and the small crossing trails of all the wild things coming closer to the cabin now than they ever had before, as though the forest itself had finally looked us over and decided, at long last, that we belonged to it, that we were part of the place, that it would take us in. The door opened behind me and Silas came out, well again, whole again, pink in the cheeks, sturdy on his feet, my brother alive. He was carrying 2 tin cups of something hot, holding them out careful and proud in front of him with both hands. "It's hot," he announced. He had figured out, all on his own, how to make a kind of sweet tea out of the dried apples. I made it myself. Don't spill it. We sat down together on the cold porch steps, side by side, the way we'd sat 1,000 times, and we wrapped our hands around the warm cups. Behind us, through the window, I could hear Roy moving around inside, building up the morning fire, getting ready for the day's work. He had stayed. When it was all settled and done, he had asked me, shy as a boy, turning his hat in his hands, the way old Hank did, whether there might be a place for him here too. And Walter's own words were right there, waiting to give him his answer. Whoever should come in true need of it, there was a place. There would always be a place. That was the whole entire point of everything. That was the thing the old man had been trying to say with his life and his land and his letters that never found their way. A home is a place that has room in it for whoever comes to the door in need. For a long while, my brother and I didn't say anything at all. We just drank our apple tea and watched the smoke climb and watched the hard winter sun come up over the snow and set the whole white world to glittering. Then Silas looked up at me, and he asked me the question. The same question, in one form or another, that he had been asking me since the night we walked out of Vernon's door into the dark. "Wren," he said, "do you think we're still lost?" I looked out across that long, white, glittering clearing at the cabin with its straight gray ribbon of smoke, at the sleeping orchard and the never-failing spring and the 63 acres that my grandfather had kept for us his whole life long, kept for grandchildren he would never get to meet, kept on nothing but hope and love and a stubborn old faith that we might someday find our way home, at the fox tracks crossing the snow, at my brother's pink, healthy, living, breathing face. And I shook my head. "No," I said, "no, baby, I don't think we're lost at all anymore." I put my arm around his shoulders and pulled him in against my side, and he let me, and leaned his head against me, and the steam went up off both our cups into the bright and bitter air. I think we finally came home. The world believed it had taken everything from us, an uncle who couldn't keep us, a mother in the cold ground, a father gone before that, a door shut in our faces in the dark, and 40 miles of nothing on the other side of it. But up in the pines, in a place the world had clean forgotten, 2 thrown-away children built a whole life out of the very things that had been left behind. A broken cabin, a cold dead stove, a frozen garden gone to weed, an orchard nobody picked, and an old man's letters that never once found their way home until 2 lost grandchildren found their way to them. And I learned the one thing that I had needed my whole short, hard life to learn. The thing I had been waiting for without even knowing I was waiting. I was never, ever as alone as I had believed myself to be. The love had been there the whole time, all along, from the very beginning. It was just looking for my address. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the very end of this. I know it was a long road and a hard one in places, and I am more grateful than I can say that you walked the whole of it beside me. If this story touched your heart tonight, if it made you cry a little, or made you remember someone you loved, or made you believe just a bit more in the good that's still out there in this world, then I would be so deeply grateful if you would subscribe to this channel. This is a place where we tell stories about hope, about second chances, about finding family in the places you'd least expect it, and about coming home, no matter how long the road, no matter how late the hour. And before you go tonight, I would dearly love to hear from you. Tell me, down in the comments, which do you believe matters more in the end, the blood you happen to be born with, or the people who choose freely to love you and keep you? And tell me this, if you will. Have you ever in your own long life found family in a place you never once expected to find it? Have you ever found home where you were sure there was none left for you? Your story matters. It matters more than you know. Share it down below, because I promise you, someone scrolling past tonight, lonely and tired and ready to give up, needs to read exactly your words. Until the next story, you take good care of yourself. And please, Please remember, no matter how old you are, or how far you've wandered, or how many doors have been shut in your face, it is never, ever too late to come home.